Sarah Whitmore liked to arrive early, not because she needed the time, but because the building felt different before the rest of the world caught up to her. At 6:45 in the morning, the glass and steel tower on Market Avenue belonged to her alone. The lobby lights hummed softly, the marble floors shone like mirrors, and the city outside was still stretching awake. It was in those quiet moments that Sarah felt most powerful. No assistants hovering, no board members questioning her projections, just her reflection in the glass doors. Tailored suit, flawless makeup, posture sharpened by years of climbing past people who hadn't moved fast enough. She tapped her access card against the turnstile, heels clicking with deliberate authority, and crossed the lobby with the confidence of someone who believed the world had already agreed to her importance. Her phone was in her hand, already open to emails, her thumb scrolling as if every message were a personal summons. Numbers, contracts, acquisitions. This was the air she breathed. The janitor was there too. He always was. He stood near the elevators, pushing a gray cart that rattled softly when it rolled. His uniform was neat but faded, the blue fabric worn thin at the elbows. A mop leaned against the side. A bucket sloshed faintly, and perched on the top shelf of the cart, always there, always different, was some kind of odd contraption. Wires, metal plates, bits of plastic, sometimes small screens that flickered faintly. It looked like a science fair project abandoned halfway through, or a child's attempt at building something sharpsent beyond their reach. Sarah didn't slow down. "Morning," he said, his voice calm, warm even, like he meant it. She glanced at him just long enough to acknowledge his existence without truly seeing him. She replied, eyes already back on her phone. His name was Mark. She knew that much because someone had mentioned it once in passing, probably HR. Mark, the janitor. Mark with the strange gadgets. Mark who took up space in her peripheral vision and nowhere else. As she passed, she caught a glimpse of the device on his cart that morning. It was smaller than usual, a palm-sized box with a row of blinking lights and a small, exposed fan that spun silently. She frowned, despite herself. "What is that?" she asked, stopping just long enough for the question to sound like an inconvenience. Mark looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Just testing a prototype. Helps regulate airflow in enclosed spaces. Cuts energy waste." Sarah let out a short laugh before she could stop herself. It escaped sharp and dismissive, echoing slightly in the lobby. "Right," she said. "Of course it does." Mark didn't bristle. He didn't shrink either. He simply nodded, as if she'd said something reasonable. "Still needs refining," he replied. Sarah shook her head, already stepping toward the elevator. "You should be careful," she added over her shoulder. "Facilities might not appreciate, whatever that is." The elevator doors slid open, swallowing her whole. As they closed, she caught one last glimpse of Mark, still standing there, still smiling faintly, as if her words hadn't landed at all. By the time she reached the executive floor, she'd forgotten him entirely. That was the pattern. Sarah Whitmore did not forget deals. She did not forget slights. She did not forget numbers, names, or faces that mattered. But Mark existed in a category she had long ago learned to ignore. Background, infrastructure. Necessary, perhaps, but unremarkable. The kind of person whose presence you noticed only when something went wrong. Her day accelerated the moment she stepped off the elevator. Assistants converged. Calendars were recited. Coffee appeared in her hand without her asking. She moved through it all with practiced efficiency, issuing instructions, correcting phrasing, approving decisions in clipped sentences that left no room for debate. The boardroom was already filling when she arrived for the morning strategy meeting. Glass walls, long polished table, leather chairs arranged with precision. Her seat waited at the head, slightly wider than the others. She took it without ceremony. As presentations flickered across the screen, Sarah leaned back, arms crossed, mind working several steps ahead. Market trends, competitors, weaknesses she could exploit, strengths she could amplify. This was where she belonged, where she was sharpest. And yet, during a lull, while a junior executive stumbled through a slide about sustainability initiatives, her mind drifted, uninvited, back to the lobby. The little device, the spinning fan, the way Mark had said, cuts energy waste, as if it were obvious. She dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. Everyone had ideas. Most of them were bad. After the meeting, as she walked back to her office, she noticed something else she normally ignored. The building felt cooler than usual. Not cold, exactly, but balanced. The air circulated evenly, no stagnant pockets near the windows, no overzealous blasts from the vents. She frowned. Facilities had been complaining about HVAC inefficiencies for months. Budget overruns, inconsistent temperature control. She'd signed off on several expensive assessments with no real improvement. She paused near a vent, holding her hand up, feeling the airflow. It was steady, gentle. Coincidence, she told herself. Her office door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing her back into her world of glass, steel, and control. Downstairs, Mark moved methodically through the lobby, emptying trash bins, wiping fingerprints from the brass railings. The device on his cart hummed quietly, lights pulsing in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He adjusted a small dial, watching the response with focused eyes. He made a note in a battered notebook tucked into his back pocket. Small handwriting. Precise. At 9:15, Sarah emerged from her office for another meeting. This one was with a potential investor, a man who valued optics as much as returns. She walked briskly, already rehearsing her talking points. Mark was mopping near the elevators again. She stepped around the wet floor sign with visible irritation. "Does that have to be right there?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at his equipment. He looked up. "Elevator traffic's lighter now," he said. "Safer this way." Sarah sighed as if burdened by the need to explain basic reality. "Just try not to disrupt things," she said. "Some of us are working." The words hung between them, sharp and unnecessary. Mark met her gaze. For a brief moment, something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that same mild, unbothered expression. "Of course," he said. She moved on, satisfied. The investor meeting went well. It always did. Sarah was in her element, speaking confidently about growth trajectories and innovation pipelines. She used words like visionary and forward-thinking, gesturing to sleek mock-ups of future products. What she didn't mention, what she didn't know, was that several of the energy-saving features she proudly highlighted were now operating more efficiently because of a device humming quietly in the lobby below. By lunchtime, Sarah's patience was thinning. A delayed report, a supplier issue, an assistant who mispronounced a client's name. Each irritation stacked neatly atop the last, forming a pressure she carried in the tight line of her jaw. She decided to eat in the executive lounge, a space designed to feel casual while remaining exclusive. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, curated art that suggested culture without commitment. Mark was there too. He was emptying recycling bins, his cart parked discreetly near the wall. Another contraption sat atop it, larger this time. A flat panel with sensors arranged in a grid, wires feeding into a compact processor. Sarah stopped short. "Is that a solar panel?" she asked, incredulous. Mark glanced at it. "Partly," he said. "It's adaptive. Adjusts based on interior lighting conditions, too." She stared at him, then laughed outright. "You're building renewable energy systems now?" He shrugged. "Trying to." Sarah shook her head, amusement and annoyance mixing. "You know we have entire departments for that, right? Engineers. Teams of them." "I know," Mark said. "Doesn't mean individuals can't think too." The comment landed harder than she expected. Sarah's smile thinned. "Thinking is one thing," she said coolly. "Delivering results is another." Mark nodded again, unperturbed. "That's true." She turned away, dismissing him with the ease of someone accustomed to the last word. But as she ate, she felt his presence like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. The quiet confidence, the way he didn't scramble to justify himself. Later that afternoon, a facilities manager knocked on her door, excitement barely contained. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Our energy consumption dropped 12% overnight." Sarah looked up from her screen. "What changed?" "That's the thing," he said. "Nothing. At least nothing we authorized." Her eyes narrowed. "Find out," she said, "and make sure it stays within protocol." He nodded and left. Sarah leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, irritation simmering beneath her composure. Unauthorized changes were unacceptable. Order mattered. Control mattered. Down in the maintenance closet, Mark carefully dismantled another prototype, labeling components, storing them in neatly organized bins. The space was small, dimly lit, but every inch was used with intention. Blueprints lined one wall, rolled and stacked. Patent documents sat in a locked drawer beneath a workbench scarred by years of use. He wiped his hands on a rag, then checked his watch. At 4:30, Sarah's day began its final sprint. Calls, approvals, last-minute adjustments before tomorrow's board presentation. She barely noticed the building emptying around her. When she finally stepped into the elevator to leave, exhaustion tugged at her shoulders. The doors opened onto the lobby, now bathed in the warm glow of evening lights. Mark was there, of course. He was adjusting the airflow device again, humming softly to himself. Sarah hesitated, then spoke. "You know," she said, voice edged with condescension masked as advice, "if you really want to invent things, you should probably do it on your own time." Mark looked up, meeting her gaze. "I do," he said. She scoffed. "Right." The doors opened behind her, revealing the city beyond. She walked out without another glance. As she disappeared into the evening, Mark returned to his work, fingers moving with practiced ease. The device responded, lights settling into a steady pattern. He smiled, not out of spite, not out of pride, but out of quiet certainty. Above him, in offices filled with glass and ambition, decisions were being made that would soon collide with realities no one had bothered to look at closely. And in the echoing lobby of a building that believed it knew who mattered, The so-called janitor continued to refine ideas the world had already agreed were valuable, whether Sarah Whitmore knew it yet or not. By the middle of the week, Mark's cart had become something of a spectacle. Not officially, of course. No one stopped to admire it. No one asked for demonstrations. But eyes lingered longer than they used to, and conversations paused for just a beat when he rolled by. The contraptions had grown more elaborate, more visible, impossible to ignore if you happened to share the same space. Sarah noticed too. She noticed when she stepped out of the elevator one morning and nearly collided with what looked like a mechanical octopus sprawled across the hallway floor. Tubes snaked outward from a central hub, each ending in a small, rotating brush. The whole thing whirred softly as it moved in a slow, deliberate pattern over the carpet. She stopped short. "What on earth is that?" Mark, crouched nearby with a tablet in his hand, looked up. "Self-cleaning mop system," he said. "It maps foot traffic patterns and adjusts frequency accordingly." Sarah stared at the thing as one of the brushes gently scrubbed at a faint coffee stain, lifting it with surprising efficiency. The carpet beneath looked noticeably cleaner. "That's ridiculous," she said, though there was less conviction in her voice than she intended. "You're overcomplicating a mop." Mark smiled faintly. "Sometimes simple tools just need better logic." She snorted. "You sound like a TED Talk." A couple of junior analysts exiting a nearby conference room slowed, curious. Sarah straightened, aware of her audience. "Don't trip over his science experiment," she said to them lightly. "Apparently, we're all living in the future now." They laughed, politely, unsure where the line was, but unwilling to cross her. Mark returned his attention to the tablet, fingers moving with quiet focus. The machine adjusted its path, avoiding their shoes seamlessly. Sarah walked on, chin lifted. Later that day, in the executive break room, she reenacted the encounter with exaggerated flair. She hunched her shoulders, mimicked an earnest tone. "It maps foot traffic," she said, eyes rolling. "As if the carpet needs a personality." Her colleagues chuckled. "I swear," she continued, sipping her espresso, "if I let him, he'd probably try to automate the trash cans too." The irony went unnoticed, because the next morning the recycling area on the ground floor looked different. Bins that were usually overflowing were neatly organized. A compact machine sat between them, scanning items as employees dropped them in. Plastic veered one way, paper another. Metal clinked softly into a separate compartment. A small screen displayed simple instructions, glowing green when items were placed correctly. People stopped, watched, tried it. "It's kind of cool," someone murmured. Sarah arrived just in time to hear that. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this?" she asked sharply. Mark, standing to the side with his hands clasped behind his back, answered calmly. "Automated recycling sorter. Reduces contamination rates." "Did anyone authorize this?" she demanded. "Facilities approved a pilot," he said. "They were having issues meeting compliance targets." Sarah scoffed. "So now you're solving regulatory problems too?" He shrugged slightly. "Just trying to help." She turned to the small crowd that had gathered. "Careful," she said with a laugh. "If you encourage him, we'll all be replaced by robots built from mop parts." The laughter this time was louder, less hesitant. Safe laughter. Sarah felt the familiar rush of control. Mark didn't respond. He simply stepped aside as someone else approached the machine, dropping in a soda can. The sorter whirred, sorted, and logged the item. In the days that followed, the building seemed to hum with subtle changes. Floors stayed cleaner longer. Trash pickups became more efficient. Energy reports ticked downward in ways that made spreadsheets look healthier without explanation. Small improvements, barely perceptible individually, but together they formed a pattern. Sarah pretended not to see it. Instead, she leaned into the joke. During a leadership lunch, she leaned over to a director and whispered, "Have you seen our resident inventor lately? I half expect him to unveil a time machine." The director smirked. "Maybe he already has." Sarah laughed, loudest of all. What she didn't see, what no one but Mark ever saw, was the meticulous system behind the chaos. After hours, when the building emptied and the echo of footsteps faded, Mark transformed the small maintenance room into something else entirely. The mop bucket was pushed aside. The workbench came alive. He laid out components with surgical precision. Each invention had a labeled tray. Each iteration was documented. Dates, measurements, efficiency percentages. Failures were noted without judgment. Lessons extracted and applied. A locked cabinet held binders. Inside them, not sketches or dreams, but finalized schematics, patent numbers, correspondence with attorneys, licensing agreements. He never rushed. When a prototype failed, he didn't curse or scrap it. He adjusted, refined, tested again. The self-cleaning mop went through 7 versions before it met his standards. The recycling sorter took 11, and each time before anything ever appeared on his cart, the paperwork was already done. During one late evening, as rain streaked the windows and the city lights blurred beyond the glass, Sarah stayed late preparing for an earnings call. Her heels were kicked off under her desk, irritation simmering as she scanned a report that made no sense. Operational costs were down. Again. She frowned, tapping the screen. "This can't be right," she muttered. She called facilities. Voicemail. Annoyed, she stood and headed for the elevator, intent on getting answers. The doors opened onto a quiet lobby, dimmed for the night. Mark was there. Of course he was. He knelt beside his cart, adjusting the recycling sorter's internal components. The soft glow of its screen illuminated his face. "Still here?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. He looked up. "Almost done." She crossed her arms. "I was reviewing cost reports. Something's off." Mark considered her words carefully. "In a good way?" She hesitated. "They're lower." He nodded once. "That tracks." Her irritation flared. "You don't get to say 'that tracks' about corporate expenses." A corner of his mouth lifted. "Sorry." She paced a few steps, then stopped in front of his cart, peering at the mess of wires and panels. "Do you even know how much liability you're creating?" she asked. "If one of these things malfunctions, they're tested," he said, "extensively." She laughed again, sharp and incredulous. "Tested by who? You?" "Yes." The simplicity of the answer irritated her more than anything else. "Look," she said, lowering her voice as if explaining something fundamental to a child. "Ideas are cheap. Execution is expensive. You can't just build gadgets in a corporate building and expect them to matter." Mark stood, meeting her gaze at eye level. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just build." For a moment, the air between them felt charged. Then Sarah waved a hand dismissively. "Fine. Build away. Just don't confuse tinkering with innovation." She walked away before he could respond. The next day, Sarah brought the joke into a presentation. A slide malfunctioned briefly, freezing on a half-loaded chart. Without missing a beat, she smiled and said, "Looks like our janitor's been upgrading the system again." Laughter rippled through the room. Mark, unseen at the back as he wiped down a counter, paused for just a second. Then he resumed his work. What Sarah didn't know was that the chart froze because the system was in the middle of rerouting power to a more efficient load-balancing module. One Mark had designed. By the end of the week, whispers had begun. Not about Mark's inventions being silly, but about them working. Facilities staff noticed fewer complaints. Compliance officers noticed cleaner reports. Even IT noticed smoother energy distribution. Sarah noticed something else. Respect. Subtly shifting. A junior manager stopped laughing as quickly at her jokes. A director asked facilities more questions than usual. Someone mentioned "that janitor" with a thoughtful tone instead of amusement. It irritated her more than she cared to admit. So she doubled down. At a company-wide town hall, when Mark rolled his cart across the back of the auditorium, she gestured toward him with a grin. "Careful back there," she said into the microphone. "He's probably installing artificial intelligence into the vacuum." The laughter was scattered this time. Mark stopped, looking up briefly. Their eyes met across the room. He gave her a small nod, then continued on. Sarah turned back to the audience, unaware that several people were now watching him instead of her. That night, alone in the maintenance room, Mark updated his logs. He checked off milestones, filed away another signed document, and placed a fresh patent certificate into the drawer. He locked it carefully. Above him, in offices filled with glass walls and unchecked confidence, Sarah Whitmore slept soundly, convinced she had correctly categorized the man who cleaned her floors. She believed his ideas were jokes. She had no idea how organized his success already was. Mark left the building later than usual that night. The lobby lights dimmed automatically as he pushed his cart toward the service exit, the soft hum of machines fading behind him. Outside, the city had slipped into its quieter rhythm. Traffic thinned, storefronts darkened, neon signs flickering like tired eyes. He paused just long enough to lock the door behind him, then walked toward the bus stop with measured steps, the kind that came from routine rather than fatigue. No one from the building ever saw where he went after hours. To them, his existence ended when the floors were clean and the trash was gone. Mark's apartment sat above a closed tailor shop on the edge of an older neighborhood, the kind that had once been vibrant and was now waiting patiently for someone to notice it again. The stairs creaked underfoot as he climbed, keys jingling softly in his hand. Inside, the space was modest but deliberate. Clean lines, neutral colors, nothing excessive. What stood out were the walls. They weren't decorated with art or photographs, but with frames. Certificates, technical diagrams, patent filings, some finalized, some pending, all neatly aligned. Each one represented years of thought, iterations that never saw daylight, failures refined into function. Mark hung his jacket, washed his hands, and moved straight to the small desk by the window. He opened his laptop, logged into a secure portal, and reviewed updates. 3 new licensing inquiries. He read them slowly, carefully. No rush. He flagged 2 for follow-up, archived the 3rd. His phone buzzed. "Evening, Mark," a woman's voice said when he answered. "Evening, Elaine." Elaine Porter had been his intellectual property attorney for nearly a decade. efficient, precise, and unimpressed by bravado. They spoke in shorthand now, a mutual understanding built over countless filings and negotiations. "I reviewed the provisional you sent," she said. "The adaptive airflow system is solid. Very solid." Mark smiled faintly. "I thought so." "You were right to separate the control logic from the hardware claims," she continued. "It gives you flexibility." "That was the idea," she paused. "You know, if the company you work for ever realized what they have under their roof, they won't," Mark said gently. "And that's fine." Elaine chuckled softly. "All right. I'll move forward with the full filing. Expect confirmation by Friday." "Thank you." When the call ended, Mark leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the window. Below, a couple argued quietly on the sidewalk, their words lost to distance. Life went on, unaware of the quiet accumulation happening in that small apartment. The next morning, Sarah Whitmore arrived early again. She liked the illusion of solitude before the day began, the sense that she was ahead of everyone else. She poured herself coffee in the executive lounge, scrolling through overnight emails. One subject line caught her attention. Operational Efficiency Review, Preliminary Findings. She opened it, scanning quickly. The numbers were impressive. Too impressive. Cost reductions, energy savings, waste management improvements, all trending upward. She frowned. There was no mention of new contracts, no major capital investments, nothing she could take credit for. "Unacceptable," she muttered. Later that day, she cornered the facilities manager near the elevators. "I want a full breakdown," she said. "Every change, every variable." He nodded nervously. "We're compiling it." "Good," she said, "because this doesn't just happen." She didn't notice Mark standing a few feet away, quietly replacing a light panel. He listened without looking up. That evening, instead of heading straight home, Mark took a different route. He got off the bus downtown, walked 3 blocks, and entered a granite building with gold lettering by the door. United States Patent and Trademark Office, Regional Office. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. Mark signed in, exchanged a nod with the receptionist, and took a seat. He pulled a folder from his bag, reviewing its contents while he waited. Across town, Sarah attended a networking event at a rooftop bar, laughter and clinking glasses surrounding her. She spoke animatedly about innovation, about staying ahead of the curve, about spotting talent. "Some people just don't see the future," she said confidently, sipping her drink. Back at the patent office, Mark met with an examiner. They discussed claims, prior art, potential challenges. Mark answered every question calmly, referencing data, pointing to diagrams. "Your portfolio is extensive," the examiner said, flipping through the files, "and unusually cohesive." Mark nodded. "They're designed to work together." The examiner raised an eyebrow. "Most inventors don't think that far ahead." Mark smiled. "I've had time." Days passed. Mark's routine continued, unchanged on the surface. Early mornings, quiet work. Evenings spent refining, filing, planning. His apartment filled slowly with new frames, new confirmations. One night, as he prepared dinner, his phone rang again. "Mark, it's Elaine," came the familiar voice. "We've got interest, serious interest." He set the knife down carefully. "From?" "A multinational energy firm. They want to discuss licensing, global." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. "Send them the terms." he said. Across the city, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to explain itself. The numbers told a story she didn't like, one where progress happened without her direction. She leaned back, irritation creeping into something sharper. "Someone is making moves," she said aloud. She just didn't know who. The quiet accumulation continued, unseen, unstoppable, as two very different visions of success moved steadily toward an inevitable intersection. If anyone had followed Mark after midnight, they might have mistaken his life for one defined by restraint. There were no flashy cars parked outside his building, no late-night parties spilling into the street, no signs of indulgence that typically accompanied success. What they would have seen instead was a man returning home quietly, carrying groceries in reusable bags, nodding politely to the elderly woman downstairs who never remembered his name but always smiled at him. Inside his apartment, the silence was purposeful. Mark cooked simply: rice, vegetables, grilled chicken, often while listening to recorded lectures or technical discussions played at low volume. He ate at the small table by the window, laptop open, scrolling through diagrams and notes between bites. To an outsider, it might have looked like obsession. To Mark, it was alignment. Every project he worked on fed into another. The adaptive airflow system informed the energy balancing module. The recycling sorter's sensor logic fed into waste optimization algorithms. Even the self-cleaning mop wasn't just about cleaning. It was about pattern recognition, automation in unpredictable environments, learning systems that could adapt without constant oversight. None of it was random. Pinned above his desk was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. It wasn't a patent or a schematic, but a handwritten outline. Boxes connected by arrows, systems feeding systems, a quiet ecosystem of ideas designed to scale. Mark checked the time, then dialed a number. Elaine answered on the second ring. "You're up late," she said. "So are you." "Fair," she replied. "I was reviewing your latest filing. The waste sorting expansion?" "Yes, you've effectively future-proofed it." Mark smiled. That was the goal. Elaine hesitated. "You realize once these licenses start activating, it's going to get attention." "I know." "And your employer has no claim," Mark finished calmly. "Everything was developed independently, off the clock, using personal resources. We've been careful." Elaine exhaled softly. "You've been more than careful. You've been surgical." He said nothing, letting the words settle. Across town, Sarah Whitmore was restless. She lay awake in her penthouse apartment, city lights painting faint patterns across the ceiling. Her phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark, but her mind refused to follow suit. Numbers replayed behind her eyes, graphs trending in directions she hadn't planned. She prided herself on foresight, on being the one who saw opportunities before others did. So why did it feel like she was reacting instead of leading? The next morning she arrived at the office earlier than usual, irritation sharpening her focus. She summoned her assistant before the first meeting of the day. "I want a full audit of facilities operations," she said. "Informal, off the books." The assistant blinked. "Is there a concern?" "There's a discrepancy," Sarah replied. "And I don't like surprises." Mark was already there, polishing the chrome fixtures near the elevators. He listened as Sarah spoke, his expression unchanged. When she walked away, he finished his task, then quietly adjusted a sensor behind a vent. The building breathed easier. That afternoon, Mark took a half day. No one questioned it. Janitors were interchangeable in Sarah's mind, their schedules invisible unless something went wrong. He changed out of his uniform in the maintenance room, folding it neatly before placing it in his locker. From a hidden compartment in his bag, he retrieved a slim folder and a tablet. He walked 3 blocks to a cafe near the patent office. The place was quiet, favored by freelancers and professionals who needed anonymity more than ambiance. Mark ordered tea, took a seat by the window, and waited. Elaine arrived precisely on time. They spread documents across the small table. Voices low, movements efficient. Licensing terms, jurisdictional considerations, timelines. "You've crossed a threshold," Elaine said softly. "Once these contracts finalize, you won't be able to stay invisible." Mark looked out the window, watching pedestrians hurry past. "I was never trying to be invisible," he said. "Just underestimated." She smiled at that. "You've succeeded." Back at the office, Sarah sat through a presentation on long-term growth strategy. The consultant spoke confidently about emerging technologies, about sustainability and automation. Sarah interrupted him. "All of this assumes centralized innovation," she said. "Departments, budgets, oversight." The consultant nodded. "Of course." She leaned back, satisfied. Structure mattered. Control mattered. What she didn't consider was that innovation didn't always announce itself through boardrooms and budgets. That evening, Mark returned home to find a package waiting by his door. Inside was a framed certificate, freshly issued. He removed it carefully, reading the text even though he already knew it by heart. Granted. He hung it beside the others, aligning it perfectly. The wall was beginning to fill. He stepped back, not to admire, but to assess. Each frame represented leverage, options, security. His phone buzzed again. "This is Elaine," came the familiar voice, this time edged with excitement she rarely allowed herself. "We just received confirmation. The energy firm wants exclusivity." Mark closed his eyes briefly. "At our terms?" "Yes." "Then proceed." Across the city, Sarah poured herself a drink she didn't need. The audit she'd requested had come back inconclusive. Everything was technically within bounds. Too clean. She stared out at the skyline, unease creeping in where certainty used to live. Over the following weeks, Mark's life continued its quiet rhythm, but the undercurrent shifted. Emails arrived from overseas. Calls came at odd hours. Each interaction added another layer to the structure he'd been building for years. He still showed up every morning in his blue uniform, still pushed the same cart, still nodded politely when Sarah passed without really seeing him. But something in him had changed. Not his demeanor, but his timing. He checked his watch more often now. Sarah, meanwhile, grew sharper, more demanding. She sensed movement she couldn't trace, progress she couldn't claim. Her jokes about Mark stopped landing the way they used to. Colleagues smiled politely, then changed the subject. One afternoon, she overheard 2 managers discussing energy metrics in hushed, impressed tones. "That improvement is unheard of," one said. "Yeah," the other replied. "It's like someone redesigned the system from the ground up." Sarah stepped in. "Someone did?" she said coolly. "And I want to know who." They exchanged glances. "Facilities," one offered weakly. She walked away, jaw tight. That night, Mark stood in his apartment, phone pressed to his ear, listening as Elaine outlined the final steps. "Once the public filings are complete," she said, "there's no putting this back in the shadows." I understand. And your workplace? Mark looked at the wall of frames. Will become just that, he said. A workplace, not my future. He ended the call and sat down, hands resting on his knees. The long game was nearly finished. Across the city, Sarah Whitmore slept fitfully, unaware that the quiet accumulation she'd laughed at was about to surface, and that her short-sighted confidence was about to meet something far more patient than ambition. The moment of convergence was no longer distant. It was scheduled. The first crack appeared in the form of an email no one thought was important. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, addressed to several department heads and copied to the executive team. The subject line was dry, almost forgettable. External inquiry, facilities systems integration. Sarah skimmed it between sips of coffee, expecting nothing more than a vendor pitch or a routine compliance check. Halfway through the second paragraph, she stopped. An external firm, large, well-funded, global, was requesting detailed information about the building's energy, waste, and automation systems, not to sell anything, but to understand what was already in place. She reread the message, irritation stirring. Who had invited scrutiny? She forwarded it to facilities with a single line: explain. Across the building, Mark read the same email on a small screen mounted discreetly inside a maintenance cabinet. He didn't react outwardly. He finished replacing a filter, logged the task, and moved on. But later, when he checked his watch, his movement slowed just a fraction. Timing mattered now. That evening, Mark didn't go straight home. He stopped instead at Elaine's office, a quiet suite tucked into an older building that smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. The walls were lined with law books, their spines worn by years of use. Elaine closed the door behind him. "They've made contact," she said. "I saw." "They're impressed," she continued. "Enough to ask questions." Mark nodded. Questions lead to answers, and answers lead to visibility. He met her gaze. "Which is why we're ready." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies, patents granted, patents pending, licensing drafts awaiting signatures. The weight of it was physical. "You've built something rare," Elaine said quietly. "Not just inventions, leverage." Mark closed the folder carefully. "Then it's time to use it." Back at the office, Sarah's irritation grew into something sharper. Facilities' response was vague. Improvements, incremental upgrades, pilot initiatives. Nothing concrete. Nothing she could put her name on or control. She called an impromptu meeting. "I don't like being in the dark," she said to the room. "Someone is changing systems without executive oversight." A manager cleared his throat. "Technically, everything's within operational discretion." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Technically isn't good enough." No one mentioned Mark. They didn't need to. In her mind, he still existed as a joke, an annoyance, a harmless eccentric pushing a mop. That illusion began to strain. The external firm arrived the following week. They were polite, professional, curious in a way that made people uneasy. They toured the building with clipboards and tablets, asking detailed questions about airflow patterns, energy distribution, waste handling. Mark accompanied them, as assigned by facilities. Sarah noticed him trailing behind the group and felt a flicker of annoyance. "Why is he here?" she asked under her breath. "He knows the systems," someone replied. Sarah scoffed but said nothing. As the tour progressed, the visitors' attention gravitated toward Mark despite themselves. They asked him questions directly. He answered succinctly, without jargon, explaining not just what the systems did, but why they behaved the way they did. One of them nodded slowly. "This is elegant," he said. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. That evening, she replayed the day in her mind, irritation giving way to suspicion. She opened her laptop at home, pulling up internal records, maintenance logs, facilities notes. Patterns emerged. Names repeated. Mark's name. She stared at the screen longer than she meant to. Meanwhile, Mark sat in his apartment, phone pressed to his ear, listening to Elaine outline next steps. "They'll want exclusivity tied to performance," she said. "And once that's public, my employer will notice," Mark finished. "Yes." He looked around the room at the framed certificates, the diagrams, the quiet proof of years spent building instead of boasting. "That's acceptable," he said. Days later, Sarah received another report. This one wasn't about efficiency or costs. It was about intellectual property exposure. She read it twice, then a third time. Certain systems, key systems, were not owned by the company. They were licensed, temporarily. Her pulse quickened. She stood abruptly, heels clicking sharply as she crossed her office. "Get legal," she said to her assistant. "Now." In the maintenance room, Mark packed away tools he wouldn't need anymore. Not yet. He left the room spotless, as always. He checked his watch. Soon. Sarah's meeting with legal was tense. Questions flew. Who owned what? Since when? How had this gone unnoticed? Answers came slowly. Privately held patents. Independently developed. Lawfully installed under pilot agreements. Sarah felt the ground shift. She thought of every joke, every dismissive glance, every time she'd laughed at the man who now occupied the center of a problem she couldn't bully away. That night, Mark returned home to find Elaine waiting in his apartment. Documents spread neatly across the table. "It's time," she said. He nodded. Outside, the city moved as it always had, unaware that quiet preparation was about to give way to consequence. Inside a glass tower on Market Avenue, Sarah Whitmore sat alone in her office long after everyone else had left, staring out at a skyline that suddenly felt less like a prize and more like a warning. The quiet accumulation had reached critical mass. What came next would no longer be quiet. Sarah Whitmore did not sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the city's glow seeping through the edges of the curtains, painting slow-moving shadows she couldn't ignore. Her mind replayed the legal meeting again and again, each sentence sharpening with repetition. Privately held patents, lawfully licensed, independently developed. She had built her career on knowing where power lived, who controlled it, how it moved, how to leverage it. Power came from ownership, from contracts, from visibility. And yet something had grown inside her building, beneath her notice, outside her control. By morning, the unease hardened into resolve. She arrived at the office before dawn, heels echoing too loudly in the empty lobby. The building no longer felt like hers. It felt compromised. Mark was already there. He stood near the maintenance desk, reviewing a checklist, his cart parked neatly beside him. He looked up as Sarah approached, nodding politely. "Good morning," he said. She studied him in a way she never had before. The same uniform, the same calm posture. But now she noticed details she'd dismissed for years. the steadiness of his gaze, the unhurried confidence in his movements. "How long," she asked abruptly, "have you been working here?" Mark considered the question. "Almost 12 years. 12, she repeated. She exhaled sharply, as if that number carried an accusation. "And during that time you've been inventing?" "Yes." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her. She lowered her voice. "You understand that anything developed on company property was not," Mark said gently. "Everything I've developed was done on my own time, with my own resources. The systems installed here are licensed." Her jaw tightened. He sounded prepared, too prepared. "We'll be reviewing those licenses," she said. "I expected that." She bristled. "You seem very comfortable for someone whose work is under scrutiny." Mark met her gaze. "Scrutiny isn't a problem when you've planned for it." She turned away without responding. By mid-morning, the office buzzed with restrained tension. Meetings were postponed. Legal teams occupied conference rooms. Facilities staff whispered in hallways. Sarah moved through it all with clipped efficiency, issuing directives, demanding updates. But beneath the surface, she felt something she hated more than confusion. She felt behind. In a glass-walled conference room, Elaine sat across from the company's legal counsel, folders neatly arranged in front of her. Mark sat beside her, hands folded, posture relaxed. "This is highly irregular," one of the attorneys said. Elaine smiled politely. "It's highly uncommon." "Not irregular." She slid a document across the table. "Here are the filings. Here are the dates. Here are the licensing agreements your client signed." The attorney flipped through them, brow furrowing. "These patents cover core operational systems," he said. "Yes," Elaine replied. "That's why the licenses are valuable." Sarah watched from the far end of the room, arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. Every page turned felt like another inch slipping from her grasp. "How much?" she asked finally. Elaine looked at Mark before answering. "The licensing fees are modest for now. Performance-based." "For now," Sarah echoed. Mark spoke. "They were never meant to be punitive." She snapped her gaze toward him. "Then what were they meant to be?" "Fair." The word landed with quiet force. The meeting ended without resolution. Legal teams retreated to regroup. Elaine gathered her papers, nodding once to Mark before leaving. Sarah remained behind. "You've put us in an impossible position," she said, her voice low. Mark shook his head. "I put myself in a secure one." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "You think this ends well for you?" He met her eyes evenly. "I think it ends honestly." She turned away, anger flaring. Honesty had never been the currency of power in her world. That evening, Mark returned home later than usual. The quiet of his apartment wrapped around him like a familiar coat. He removed his jacket, hung it carefully, and stood for a moment in front of the wall of frames. They now filled nearly the entire space. He checked his phone. A message from Elaine waited. "They're pushing back, as expected." He replied with a single word. "Good." Across the city, Sarah hosted an emergency call with senior leadership. Faces filled the screen, concern etched into each one. "How did this happen?" someone demanded. Sarah straightened. "We underestimated an internal asset." "A janitor?" another voice scoffed. She didn't correct them. "We need leverage," a board member said. "Find it." Sarah muted her mic, staring at the screen. Leverage. That was the language she understood. The next day, she summoned Mark to her office. He arrived promptly, hands clasped in front of him, expression unreadable. "We can make this go away," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Buy out your patents, bring you on as a consultant, quietly." Mark didn't sit. "I'm not interested." Her eyes flashed. "Everyone has a price." "Not everyone has the same goals." She leaned forward. "You could be very comfortable." "I already am." The words hit harder than any insult. She dismissed him with a wave, fury simmering beneath her composure. That night, Mark met Elaine once more. They reviewed timelines, public disclosures, next steps. "Once this goes public," she said, "there's no undoing it." "I know. And your employer will react." "They already are." Elaine studied him. "Are you ready for that?" Mark thought of the years spent being overlooked, of laughter echoing behind him, of systems quietly improving while credit flowed elsewhere. "Yes," he said. Back in her penthouse, Sarah stared at a city that no longer felt conquered. The strategies she'd relied on, pressure, control, dismissal, slipped uselessly through her fingers. For the first time in her career, she faced something she couldn't outrun or overpower. It was patient, and it was prepared. The quiet accumulation was no longer confined to shadows. It was stepping into the light. And the reckoning it promised was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. The announcement did not come with fanfare. It arrived the way most irreversible things do, quietly, formally, wrapped in neutral language that gave no hint of the tremor it would send through the building. At 8:12 a.m., an internal memo was distributed to senior leadership, legal, facilities, and corporate communications. Sarah received it while standing at the window of her office, coffee cooling in her hand. Subject: Notice of Intellectual Property Disclosure and Licensing Transition. She read it once, then again. The company had been formally notified that several core operational systems currently in use would soon be referenced in a public patent registry update tied to a multi-party licensing agreement. The disclosure was routine, mandatory, unavoidable. The name attached to the filing sat there plainly, stripped of context and hierarchy. Mark Ellison. Sarah felt the room tilt, not dramatically, not enough to stumble, but just enough to make her grip the edge of the desk. She exhaled slowly. Across the building, Mark was polishing a railing near the atrium, the sound of cloth against metal steady and rhythmic. He checked his phone only once, long enough to see Elaine's message. "Filed." He replied with a single word. "Acknowledged." The atrium filled gradually with employees arriving for the day. Conversations overlapped. Shoes echoed. Coffee machines hissed. The building felt alive in a way it hadn't before, as if it sensed something moving beneath its surface. Sarah convened an emergency meeting before 9. The room filled fast. Legal counsel, communications, 2 board representatives patched in remotely. Faces were tight, voices clipped. "This will become public within 48 hours, legal said. "We can't delay it." "We can control the narrative," communications offered. Sarah stared at the table, at the polished surface that reflected her own expression back at her. Controlled, composed. But something brittle threaded through it now. "What's our exposure?" a board member asked. Legal hesitated. "Operational dependence is significant." Silence settled. Sarah straightened. Then we pivot, she said. We frame this as innovation support, internal talent recognition. No one spoke, because everyone in the room knew the truth. They had mocked him. By midday, whispers had begun. Someone in IT noticed the patent registry update before it was officially announced. Someone else connected the name to facilities logs. By lunch, the story had a shape. The janitor. People stared when Mark passed, curiosity replacing indifference. Some smiled awkwardly. Others looked away, suddenly unsure how to categorize him. He noticed, of course, but he didn't change his pace. In the early afternoon, Elaine arrived at the building, escorted directly to a conference room. Mark joined her minutes later, his uniform immaculate, posture calm. "This is the moment they'll try to renegotiate," she said quietly. "I know. And once this becomes public, the valuation will take care of itself," Mark finished. She smiled faintly. "You've always been patient." "Patience isn't passive," he replied. "It's deliberate." Sarah watched them from across the glass wall. For the first time, she saw the imbalance clearly. She had sprinted from quarter to quarter, chasing visible wins, measurable acclaim. Mark had moved on a longer timeline, one that didn't need applause to validate it. That evening, the company issued a carefully worded statement celebrating independent innovation and strategic licensing partnerships. It avoided specifics. It avoided names. The internet did not. By morning, the story had spread. A facilities worker with multiple patents. A hidden innovator. A quiet millionaire. Journalists called. Analysts speculated. Industry blogs dissected the filings with awe. Sarah arrived to a building that felt hostile in its curiosity. Mark arrived to one that felt newly attentive. He was summoned to HR, then legal, then corporate communications. Each meeting followed the same pattern: measured praise, thinly veiled urgency, requests framed as opportunities. He declined them all politely. "I'm fulfilling existing agreements," he said. "Nothing more." Sarah called him into her office one last time. This time there was no pretense. "You planned this," she said. "Yes. You let us rely on your systems." "You chose to," he replied. She laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor. "You could have said something." "I did," Mark said. "You laughed." The words landed between them, heavy with memory. She said nothing. That night, Mark stood in his apartment, adding another frame to the wall. This one wasn't a patent. It was a licensing confirmation, stamped and final. He stepped back, assessing the space. There was still room. Across the city, Sarah packed a box in her office. Not everything, just the things she wanted within reach. The board hadn't asked her to leave. Not yet. But the ground beneath her had shifted. She paused, looking out over the city one last time that night. For years, she had mistaken proximity for power. Mark checked his watch. The quiet accumulation was no longer quiet. And the next phase, public consequence, was already beginning to form. The building did not erupt in chaos the way Sarah had half expected. There were no shouting matches in hallways, no dramatic walkouts, no sudden firings announced over email. Instead, everything slowed. Meetings were delayed. Decisions were deferred. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Voices lowered. Expressions tight. It was the kind of tension that settled into the walls and stayed there, heavy and unseen. Sarah felt it immediately. She walked into the executive floor that morning and sensed the shift before anyone spoke to her. Assistants avoided eye contact. A director she passed in the corridor hesitated, then offered a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. She had been the axis of motion for so long, decisions flowing outward from her office, that the sudden deceleration felt disorienting. In contrast, Mark's day unfolded with its usual rhythm. He arrived early, as he always did, and began his rounds. Trash collected, floors cleaned, systems checked. He moved with the same quiet efficiency, though now eyes followed him openly. Not mockery this time. Assessment. A facilities technician stopped him near the loading dock. "Hey," the man said awkwardly. "Just wanted to say, impressive." Mark nodded. "Thank you." The interaction ended there. He didn't linger. By mid-morning, the board convened without Sarah. She learned about it secondhand, from an assistant who looked genuinely apologetic. "They said they'd update you afterward," she offered. Sarah closed her office door and sat down slowly. The chair felt unfamiliar, as if it no longer belonged to her. She replayed every interaction she could remember with Mark. The jokes, the dismissals, the casual cruelty she'd never labeled as such because it had never cost her anything before. Now it was costing her everything. Across the city, Mark sat in Elaine's office, reviewing a draft press release. It was understated, factual, careful not to gloat. "You don't have to protect them," Elaine said, watching him. "I'm not," Mark replied. "I'm protecting myself." She nodded. "The board has reached out. They want a meeting, without Sarah." Mark considered that. "I'll hear them out." Back at the office, Sarah was finally summoned. The boardroom felt colder than she remembered. The glass walls no longer gave her a sense of command. They made her feel exposed. "We're reviewing leadership alignment," the chair said carefully. Sarah understood the language. This was how power spoke when it was deciding whether to keep you. "You failed to identify a critical risk," another board member said. "And worse, you created one." She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time in her career, she had no one else to blame. Mark returned to the building that afternoon to collect his things from the maintenance room. Not because he was leaving, he hadn't decided that yet, but because his role was changing. He packed deliberately. Tools cleaned and stored. Personal notebooks slipped into his bag. He paused at the doorway, taking in the small room where so much had quietly begun. In the hallway, Sarah stood frozen as he passed. "Mark," she said. He stopped. "I didn't know," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "I know," he replied. She swallowed. "I was wrong." He met her gaze, calm and steady. "That's not what mattered." She flinched. "Then what did?" "That you never tried to know." He walked on. That evening, Sarah cleared out her office. The decision hadn't been formally announced yet, but she felt it settling into place like a verdict. Mark stood in his apartment, phone pressed to his ear, listening as Elaine outlined the final numbers. "You don't have to work another day if you don't want to," she said. Mark looked at the wall of frames. "I want to finish what I started." Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one. The board scheduled a company-wide meeting for the following week. Everyone knew what it would be about. The quiet accumulation had reached its turning point. What remained was the final reckoning, and the choice of what came after. The auditorium filled slowly, the way important rooms always did when people sensed history but didn't yet understand their place in it. Employees filed in with murmured conversations, eyes darting, voices lowered. No one joked. No one scrolled their phones. Sarah Whitmore took a seat near the aisle, several rows back from the stage. It was not where she used to sit. She noticed that immediately, the way one notices a missing tooth with the tongue. No assistant hovered beside her. No one deferred to her presence. A few people nodded politely as they passed, then looked away. The screen behind the podium glowed softly, displaying the company logo she had once helped polish into something formidable. Mark stood off to the side, near the wall, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He wore the same uniform he always had. Nothing about him suggested victory or conquest. If anything, he looked as he always had, calm, observant, patient. When the board chair stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. He spoke carefully, choosing words that balanced acknowledgement with damage control. He spoke about innovation, about oversight, about lessons learned. Then he spoke Mark's name. There was a visible ripple through the crowd. Mark walked forward when invited, each step measured. He did not smile. He did not shrink. He simply occupied the space he had earned. The chair explained the patents, the licensing agreements, the quiet ingenuity that had been operating beneath their notice for years. He did not explain Sarah. He didn't need to. When Mark was offered the microphone, he paused before speaking. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but expectant. "I didn't set out to surprise anyone," he said. His voice carried easily, steady without amplification. "I set out to solve problems." He looked out over the room. Most of the time, problems don't announce themselves from corner offices. No one laughed. He spoke briefly about systems, about patience, about the difference between visibility and value. He did not accuse. He did not defend. He simply told the truth, and the truth did the rest. Sarah listened, her expression composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Each sentence felt like a mirror held too close. When it was over, the applause came slowly at first, then grew. Not thunderous, respectful, earned. The board chair concluded the meeting with an announcement, a restructuring, a new division, an offer extended to Mark, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a strategic partnership. Mark accepted with a nod, on his terms. Sarah did not stay for the informal conversations afterward. She stood, collected her bag, and walked out before anyone could decide whether to stop her. Her office was already half empty when she returned. The box she'd packed earlier sat by the door. She added nothing to it. Before leaving, she paused, looking around the room one last time. She remembered the certainty she'd once felt here, the belief that command equaled worth. She understood now how fragile that belief had been. Downstairs, Mark returned his cart to the maintenance room. He cleaned it carefully, the way he cleaned everything, then turned off the light. Later that evening, he stood in his apartment, facing the wall of frames. There were many now, enough to tell a story without words. He didn't add anything new. He simply stood there for a long moment, then turned away. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet conclusion it had just hosted. The accumulation was complete, not because it ended, but because it no longer needed to hide. The invitation arrived embossed, heavy in the hand, the kind of thing designed to be felt before it was read. Sarah Whitmore noticed that first. She stood in her kitchen, heels kicked off near the counter. jacket draped over a chair she rarely used, and turned the card between her fingers. Thick paper, minimalist font. No unnecessary words. The company logo sat in the corner, updated, sleeker than the one she remembered approving years ago. Innovation and Systems Integration Showcase. Mandatory attendance. Executive leadership. Her jaw tightened. Mandatory was not a word often applied to her anymore. She reread the invitation, eyes skimming for context, for reassurance, for something that placed her back in control of the narrative. There was none. Just a date, a time, a location she knew too well, the downtown convention hall reserved for moments the company wanted remembered. She set the invitation down carefully, as if it might bite. Across the city, Mark read the same invitation in a very different way. It had been handed to him directly by a courier earlier that afternoon, delivered not to the maintenance room, but to Elaine's office where he had been reviewing diagrams spread across a long table. He studied the card for a moment, then placed it beside his notes without comment. Elaine watched him. "This is it," she said. "I know. They're unveiling the full scope. I expected they would." She leaned back in her chair. Most people would be nervous. Mark adjusted one of the diagrams, aligning edges with habitual precision. Nervousness comes from uncertainty. "And you're certain?" "That the work speaks for itself," he replied. "Yes." The convention hall buzzed with energy on the morning of the showcase. Banners hung from the rafters. Screens cycled through animated visuals of systems, data flows, and clean, aspirational slogans. Employees filled the space in clusters, coffee cups in hand, voices layered with excitement and curiosity. Sarah arrived alone. She moved through the crowd with practiced composure, chin lifted, expression neutral. But she felt the shift immediately. Conversations paused when she passed, not out of reverence, out of awareness. People looked at her differently now, not as the inevitable authority, but as a variable. She took a seat near the front, posture perfect, hands folded in her lap. On stage, executives took turns speaking. They talked about vision, about evolution, about learning from blind spots. Each phrase felt pointed. Sarah listened, her mind racing ahead, trying to anticipate where this was going, where she would be positioned when the curtain finally lifted. Then the lights dimmed. A new speaker was announced. Not an executive. Not a board member. The screen behind the stage shifted, displaying a clean white slide with a single line of text. Lead systems architect and independent inventor. The name appeared beneath it. Mark Ellison. The room murmured. Sarah's breath caught, not sharply, not visibly, but enough that she felt it echo in her chest. She stared at the screen, waiting for it to change, for clarification, for correction. It didn't. Mark walked onto the stage. He wasn't wearing his uniform. That was the first thing she noticed. He wore a simple suit, tailored but unremarkable, the kind chosen for comfort rather than display. He didn't stride. He didn't hesitate. He moved like someone who knew exactly why he was there. Applause rippled through the room, respectful, curious, growing. Sarah felt heat rise behind her eyes. This wasn't a reveal. It was a coronation. Mark began to speak. He didn't start with himself. He started with a problem. Inefficiency hidden in plain sight. He talked about systems people ignored because they were mundane. Maintenance, waste, repetition. People think innovation comes from disruption, he said calmly. But most of the time, it comes from attention. Slides changed behind him. Diagrams, patents, timelines. Sarah's stomach dropped. She recognized the systems, the self-cleaning floors, the waste-sorting automation, the energy optimization protocols, things she had waved away, things she had mocked. Each was now labeled, dated, and attributed. Each carried a valuation. Numbers climbed the screen. Gasps rippled through the audience. Sarah's disbelief hardened into something colder. Horror. Mark continued, outlining how the systems integrated, how they scaled, how they had already been licensed, not just internally, but externally. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't need to. She felt the weight of every sideways glance, every subtle shift in posture from the colleagues seated around her. She was no longer the lens through which this moment was viewed. She was part of the cautionary tale. When Mark finished, the applause was unmistakable. It filled the hall. He stepped back from the microphone, nodding once, and took a seat reserved for him on stage. The executives returned to frame the announcement. New divisions, strategic partnerships, long-term projections. Sarah barely heard them. Her world had narrowed to a single, undeniable truth. She had been wrong. Not just about Mark, about power. After the presentation, the floor opened for networking. People approached Mark immediately. Investors, engineers, executives who had never learned his name before today. They shook his hand. They listened. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the room sway. She considered leaving. Instead, she walked toward him. The crowd parted instinctively, not for her, but for the gravity of the moment they sensed unfolding. Mark looked up as she approached. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the noise around them faded. "I didn't know," she said, the words quiet, stripped of their former sharpness. "I know," Mark replied. Around them, people pretended not to listen. "I see it now," she said. "What you built." He inclined his head slightly. "I was always building." She swallowed. "I misjudged you." "Yes," he said gently. "That was all. No vindication, no cruelty, just truth." Someone touched Mark's arm, asking a question about scalability. He turned to answer, seamlessly, already moving forward. Sarah stood alone. For the first time in years, she understood what it felt like to be invisible. As the event wound down, she watched Mark from a distance, watched the ease with which people deferred to him, the respect that flowed naturally now that it had permission to exist. This was the reversal. Not loud, not theatrical, total. When Sarah finally left the hall, the city air felt different against her skin. Colder, sharper. She paused on the steps, looking back once at the glowing entrance. Inside, the future was being discussed, and for the first time, she was not shaping it. Mark exited later, alone, the noise of the event fading behind him. He adjusted his jacket, glanced once at his phone. A message from Elaine, short and satisfied. It went well. He replied just as simply, "It always does, when you wait long enough." The unveiling was complete. Nothing hidden remained. And the world, at last, was seeing what had been there all along. The days after the showcase passed in a blur of consequence. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed overnight. Instead, the world adjusted, quietly, efficiently, to a truth that could no longer be ignored. Sarah Whitmore felt that adjustment everywhere. It followed her through the lobby, where conversations paused just a second too long before resuming. It lingered in emails that were suddenly copied to more people than necessary. It lived in meetings where her input was acknowledged politely, then set aside with a phrase she had once used herself. "Let's circle back." She recognized the tactic instantly. She also recognized that it was no longer hers to wield. 2 days after the unveiling, she requested a meeting with Mark. Not through assistance, not through legal. She sent the message herself, brief and unadorned. "Could we talk?" The reply came an hour later, yes. They met in a small conference room overlooking the city. Neutral ground, glass walls, no hierarchy implied by furniture placement. Sarah arrived early. She stood by the window, hands clasped behind her back, watching traffic move far below. For the first time in years, she wasn't rehearsing an argument. She was rehearsing restraint. Mark entered quietly. "Thank you for agreeing," she said. He nodded. "You wanted to talk." She turned to face him. Up close, she noticed the same things she had missed for years. The steadiness, the lack of performative confidence. He wasn't relaxed because he felt superior. He was relaxed because he felt prepared. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words felt foreign in her mouth. She let them sit between them, unembellished. "I was dismissive," she continued. "I reduced you to a role. I mocked what I didn't understand." Mark listened without interrupting. "I can't undo that," she said. "But I wanted you to hear me acknowledge it." He considered her for a long moment. "I accept that you understand it now," he said. "That matters more than the apology itself." She nodded slowly. "Is there anything I can do?" "Yes," Mark replied. "Don't make the same mistake with someone else." The simplicity of the request stung more than anger would have. Their meeting ended without reconciliation or forgiveness. It didn't need either. It needed honesty. Sarah resigned 3 weeks later. The announcement was phrased carefully. Mutual decision, next chapter, gratitude for service. The language of soft landings. She read it on her phone while sitting alone in a cafe she'd never had time to visit before. The city moved around her, indifferent. She realized, with a mix of bitterness and clarity, that the company would continue just fine without her. That realization hurt. It also freed her. Mark's life changed in ways that were both dramatic and strangely mundane. The licensing revenue surged as international partners adopted his systems. Municipal buildings, airports, hospitals. Entire campuses quietly retooled their infrastructure, using ideas born from late nights and overlooked hallways. The numbers climbed higher than he had ever needed. He reinvested most of it. Not into luxuries, but into labs, scholarships, and small teams focused on practical innovation. Waste reduction, energy efficiency, automation that served people rather than replaced them. He accepted a board seat, but not a corner office. He continued to walk through buildings, observing how things actually worked. When asked why he didn't step fully into the spotlight, he gave the same answer every time. "Visibility isn't the goal," he said. "Impact is." A year later, an article circulated widely. It wasn't sensational. It didn't frame the story as revenge or scandal. It framed it as a lesson. Hidden genius. Systemic blindness. The Cost of Arrogance. Sarah read it from her apartment, smaller than the penthouse she'd once occupied, but warmer, quieter. She closed the article halfway through and stared out the window, reflecting. She had started over. Consulting work, fewer titles, more listening. It was humbling. It was necessary. Mark read the article too. He didn't save it. He was busy reviewing a prototype with a group of young engineers, encouraging questions, pushing for clarity. When one of them hesitated before speaking, he waited. "Go on," he said. "Your idea matters." That, more than any patent, felt like success. In 2025, the world liked to believe it could spot brilliance instantly. It couldn't. It never had. True success didn't always announce itself with titles or tailored suits. Sometimes it wore a uniform. Sometimes it cleaned floors. Sometimes it waited patiently while being underestimated. And sometimes, when the timing was right, it stepped forward. Not to dominate, but to be seen. The payoff wasn't just financial. It was perspective. And for those willing to learn, it lasted far longer than applause.